Looks like we're live. Welcome to today's masterclass on the Inspired Yoga Teachers Group. For those of you who are new to this group, a warm welcome. I know a couple of you, I've just admitted you guys to the group, so very welcome to this group. And this group has been created to support teachers like you to begin to refine your teaching so that you can teach from a more confident place and to adjust your cues, your sequencing, and your other teaching skills so that you can begin to empower your students in a way through your yoga classes that you teach. And my name is Wenlin. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you. I'm originally from Singapore. Now I'm based in Torino, Italy, and I've been studying movement since I was 9, and I've been teaching since 2016. For today's masterclass, it will be focused on 7 cues that you might want to reconsider or you might want to stop using, especially if you hear them or you found out about them through your 200-hour yoga teacher training. So if you're tuning in live, please, I would love to hear from you. Today's session is more of really like a Q&A, as all the sessions are. If you have any questions in the meanwhile, you can always drop a comment inside the comment box, and I'll be watching and checking in from time to time to make sure that I am responding to your questions and that it's helpful for you. And if you're watching this on replay as well, that's great. Also, just let me know if you're watching this on replay later on. Okay, so dropping into today's masterclass on cueing, which is great. Oh, hello, Karen, welcome. So with regards to cues, if you missed last week's episode, which is on the idea of functional yoga and cultivating interoception to feel a pose from the inside rather than to execute or to do the pose from the outside, no worries. A lot of today's episode will build on that, but later on I'll share the link to that episode in today's comments later on. So be sure to catch that if you haven't yet already. Make sure to definitely watch it after today's episode. Okay, so let's drop into the idea of cues. So cues are so important. They are essentially, think of it as a set of instructions, a direction or blueprint that you're giving your students so that they can begin to explore this, this map or this area, this geographical locations within the body, within their bodies. So how you cue is very, very important. So I think next week we will talk more about the rough framework of cueing, and I'll give you an idea as to like how I begin to structure my cues and some general ideas of how you can begin to look at them. Because I know for some of you, if you're a new yoga instructor, as you're cueing, it might feel very stressful and you might not know exactly what to cue, how much to cue for specific pose as well. And for example, do you cue the arm, do you cue the leg? Like, is there a specific process, and is there a standard procedure, so on and so forth? What's a good practice guideline? So we'll dive into that next week. Before we go into that next week, this week I want to look at 7 cues that you might want to stop using. And you might have heard these commonly from the teachers that trained you even for your 200-hour, or maybe even from the teachers who you've attended classes with, or even for yourself, you might be using these cues. So I'll explain each and one of them, and then we'll dive into why you might want to reconsider these cues. And as with all of my masterclasses, I offer these as an option for you to consider, for you to look at, so that I hope that these encourage you to ask more questions, to explore how it feels like in your body, for your body, and not just your body, but also the students that you work with and their bodies. Very, very important. Okay, so let's look at cueing. So a good practice here, I'm already giving a little bit of a heads up to next week's episode, is to start cueing from bottom up. Meaning you start from the base, which is where your feet are, and then upwards towards your legs, and then your torso, and then your shoulders, your limbs, and then your head, or the last portion with your drishti, your eye gaze. So why is this so important? Because if you adjust something from top down, that's structurally unstable, and you're causing instability in the body. And a lot of the problems stem from bottom up. If you don't have a strong foundation, just like for example, a tree does not have strong roots. Even if the branches are very strong and you can adjust the alignment of the branches towards the sun in a certain direction, if those roots are not well spread out, if they don't have a good wide strong base that really draws from the earth, that roots down deep into the earth, then there's no point because you will then topple over, and we see this from nature as well. You can see the growing process of plants is very important with regards to the roots, and it's often spread out and very deep as well. So this is why from cueing, it's a good rule of thumb to start from bottom up. Okay, so in line with this, let's look at some cues that you might be hearing from bottom up. So we start with the base of the feet. And the first one, which probably you're already familiar with, is relating to the pose that is the most important of all. So I'm not talking about Shavasana, I'm talking about the active version, which is Tadasana, often translated as mountain pose, or maybe Samastitihi, equal palms together, or even arms by the side, depending on which school or which lineage you follow. Okay, so whatever it is, you're supposed to stand like a mountain. And usually, probably in the lineage that you have followed, especially in the Ashtanga lineage, you are told to let your feet come together. And very often a cue that I would hear teachers use, and I don't even use this anymore, is to begin to bring your big toes together. I'm just looking at my notes. And separate your heels slightly. So sometimes this is what you might hear teachers say. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with this cue anatomically. The reason why I would like to invite you to consider this is because everyone's pelvis is different. Okay, and another important thing is when we look at the pelvis of a male, so biologically male and female, there are even bigger differences between these two species and these two genders or biological sexes. So structurally, because women bear children, the pelvis tends to be wider and larger. So the width and also the depth, how the femur bones, which is your leg, your thigh bones, fit in the socket will be different compared to a man. And if we trace back to the lineage of yoga, so Ashtanga yoga, for example, even Hatha yoga, very long time ago in India, this was practiced mostly by males. And usually, if you look at the Ashtanga tradition, many of the people who were training with Patabi joists at the time, if you look at the photos, right, they were young males as well. So very, very important, adolescents. And there's also the legend that Ashtanga yoga was actually designed to train warriors so that they could cultivate these adolescent minds, to train them so that they wouldn't have their minds distracted by all these other things around them, so that they can, really draw their attention. And there's this structure so that they can follow the structure and they'll be trained and be more disciplined. So let's go back to the cue. Why is it that from, for example, the Ashtanga lineage or whatever lineage you're in, you might be told to put your feet together? Because, this is my understanding, the male anatomy tends to be, for the pelvis, more narrow. So it's very, very stable, or more likely to be stable when your feet are together. Because for some males, when their feet are together, this is roughly hip distance apart. Or for some of them, just a slight adduction. Adduction is when your legs move closer to each other. Just like imagine when you do Garudasana, you cross your legs over one on top of the other. This is adduction, when you move your legs closer to each other. On the other hand, for females, I for one know, every time I stand with my feet together, I feel extremely wobbly because my pelvis is very wide. So I have to press actively through all four corners under my feet to make sure that I'm not wobbling and I'm not able to stand properly. So this is actually quite difficult and doesn't feel stable at all for me. So I've stopped using this cue entirely, and I just invite my students to come find a standing position that is comfortable and feels stable. And in general, this might be something, might be feet underneath where your knees are, underneath in line with your pelvis. This also depends, because if you teach some of your students who are older and they come to you with some problems like bowed legs, right, these also affect in the joints. So how will we begin to cue this for your students? It's very, very important. So if we come back to the idea of why are we doing some poses? What is the intention of the pose? So the intention of mountain pose, which is the most important, aside from corpse pose, is to find the stability and the rootedness of a mountain. So mountain is very strong, right? So how do we find that strength? Inviting students to find that strength by playing around with how far their feet should be apart, and how the feet should be in alignment with your ankles, with your knees, with your pelvis is one way of guiding your students. So right now, a lot of the time, what I invite students to do is to let their feet come underneath hip distance apart, or they can even choose shoulder distance apart if that finds it is more comfortable for them. So that's the first cue. I would like to invite you to start to rethink about whether or not you want to keep to this cue, or maybe you can let that go, or maybe you can play around. Find a way to convey what makes sense to you and see if that makes sense for your students. This is very, very important. Okay, so now we work with the feet. With the how far the feet apart, I want to talk a little bit about the base of your feet. Okay, and now please don't mind me. Now I will show you my feet. And okay, so you can see my foot here, and a good cue that you might often hear from some teachers is to press down on your big toe mound, which is here, right, underneath the mound of your big toe. And that makes sense because you want to actively press down on that foot to get that rootedness. So I have no qualms with that. But remember, the students that you work with, they may have different kinds of arches in their feet. So there are some people who have a high arch, which is like me, and I'll show you sideways what a high arch looks like. So you can see here there's a very strong and big curve. Good, I'm not sure if you can see that clearly. And some individuals, on the other hand, have a more neutral or more to the average, so to speak, kind of curve. So a regular curve. And then some of your students, or even for yourself, you might be flat-footed. So depending on the pattern and the structure of your foot, so that would affect whether or not you tend to collapse inwards, your feet collapse inwards like this, or whether your feet tend to collapse outwards. And the best way of knowing this is when you do standing balancing poses. So if you're doing tree pose, if you're doing dancer's pose, notice if you tend to collapse outwards or inwards. And if you collapse outwards, then you have to press more actively inside. If you collapse more inside, you have to press actively from the opposite direction. So a good way of cueing, instead of cueing just under the big toe mound, that I often hear some teachers say, is to instead cue through all four corners of your feet. So your big toe mound, your little toe mound, the inside corner of your heel, and the outside corner of your heel. So it becomes these four landmarks that you actively root down. And you also can invite your students to notice if their knees are collapsing inwards, so internal rotation of their femur bones. So they might be more towards being flat-footed, which means they need to press more on the outside of the feet, or they tend to have a high arch and the knees tend to fall out and away from each other. So there's external rotation of your femur bones, which then they need to actively press more on the inside, on the big toe mound and the inside corner of the heel. Does this make sense? I hope all of this makes sense, and some of this might be quite a lot of information to process, but a lot of this comes from experience, from your own experience and from your practice. Another good way of observing, for example, your students' feet is from the back, from the heel. I think I will do a separate episode on that, because a body reading, or looking at the body and then identifying, for example, certain tendencies of your students that may surface or manifest in the way they do some poses. You can already see that, from example, from how a person stands, how they sit, the alignment or the anatomy of their foot, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the second cue that you might want to reconsider, that you might want to restructure depending on the kind of students that you work with, so on and so forth. All right, so we're still at your foot, and bear with me, we still have a couple more cues. The third one is in relation to your foot and your knee, especially your toes, let's say. Okay, so often you might hear, for example, in Warrior 2, or even in actually mostly in Warrior 2 or in Trikonasana pose, triangle pose, you might, depending on which lineage you follow, you will hear teachers say, let your front heel intersect the arch of your back foot, or allow your come to heel alignment, for example, so on and so forth. So I already explained a little bit about this in last week's session, sorry, not last week, the week before session on the experiential interoception. Depending on how much you can abduct your legs, so widen your legs, and then externally rotate your front leg away from you, it will affect this orientation of, for example, this alignment of the heel to back arch or heel to heel. So I no longer give this cue, and I instead invite my students, step into a wide-legged stance, and this can be anything between 3 to 4 feet distance or even wider. Find something that you start to feel some stretching or some sensation between your legs, and then from then on you turn your front foot outwards, and this is external rotation. You're turning the foot out, so you will start to feel when you turn the foot out, the muscles that are along the side of the foot, they are contracting to turn that foot outwards. So, and then you can adjust and also play around. Okay, should the foot front heel be in line with the arch? Notice how that feels, and then also change. Notice how it feels when your heel is aligned with your back heel, and choose what works for you, what actually makes sense in your hip, rather than what looks good from the outside. So this is really, really important, and I highly encourage you, both as a teacher and also as a student, to begin exploring this in your own practice. Okay, very important, the fundamentals for Warrior 2. And many of the other stances, even leading up to half moon, for example, extended side angle, these all have your feet abducted and then one foot turning out, externally rotated, to move towards or to prepare or to be the stance that you are in. Okay, so this is the third cue that you might want to reconsider, or that you might want to experiment with, that you might want to try something different. Okay, I'm going to have a quick look at my notes. The fourth cue here that we're looking at, we're still at your feet, so important, and lower half of your body, is with regards to your knees. So sometimes you will hear, and I talked a little bit about this in the last masterclass as well, about how in yoga it seems like very often you will attend a class and a teacher will say, let your knee come to a 90-degree angle. Your knee should never pass your ankle. Okay, so again, why? Why should the knee never pass the ankle? And I already talked about this already. If you're not sure, you can do an exercise and you're not convinced. Yes, there's always a rationale for certain things. If you want to keep the knee never past the ankles, because we don't want to put too much strain on the knee, of course. And if you work with, for example, elderly individuals or someone who has just recovered from a knee injury or has sensitive knees, has arthritis, then yes, you should definitely be aware of certain things, especially if it's a weight-bearing joint. But whenever you do squats, for example, second, whenever you climb the stairs, whenever you sit down and stand up, notice what happens to your knee. Your knee always passes the ankle, always. And this is just a function of how the human body is made, how when you sit down and then when you stand up, you transfer the weight towards the front of your body, and your knees move very slightly or even a little bit more past the ankle, so that then they can straighten and then you can stand up. So actually there is no problem. And if you look at the images of, for example, I think BKS Iyengar in Light of Yoga, which is considered a yoga bible, if you see him do some of the poses, including Anjaneyasana, low lunge, his knee is well past the ankle. There's no problem with that, and he has no knee pain even up to the last years before he passed on. He had no problem with his knees at all. So I think this is another cue that you might want to reconsider. Why is it the knee should not pass the ankle, and in which situations would you cue that way? So what is the purpose of the pose? Again, coming back to this question, very, very important. What is the purpose of the pose? And a minor one in relation to this, one cue that sometimes I hear instructors give with regards to the knee joint, that one thing you might want to consider is the stacking of the joints. So often you will also hear teachers talk about how joints should be so-called stacked or aligned. So in general, it is a good idea if the knee aligns with your ankle joint, and if it aligns with your pelvis, so on and so forth, so that this actually allows everything to be aligned and allows it to feel okay, and it reduces the amount of effort, I would say, when all the joints are aligned. But a very important point is, consider if you're working with a student whose natural alignment, so when they stand, maybe they are bow-legged, or for example, that they are suffering from some kind of injury and at a normal stance, and it is comfortable for them, their knees might not be completely aligned with their ankles. Then, does this cue make sense? Again, you have to look at the situation and the person that you are working with and ask yourself, what is the purpose of this pose? Does this cue that I'm using in this specific scenario or this situation actually make sense for the person I'm working with? And am I guiding her or him in the right way so that they or him or whoever you're working with actually feels good and it is optimal for this body I'm working with? Very, very important that. And going back to the idea of the alignment for Warrior 2, often you might hear teachers say, let the knee move or track the second or third toe. This is a good cue. It's not a bad cue because why do teachers often cue this way? So, and I often ask myself this question, what was the rationale behind this? And the rationale, I think, if I understood correctly, is because most teachers are concerned that your knee will collapse inwards. So your knee, instead of being aligned right on top of where the ankle is in Warrior 2, instead collapses inwards, instead of being straight right on top, this so-called 90-degree angle and bending, it collapses inwards like this, which is not great. It means you're not working with your you're not working with your external muscles along your thigh, your outer thigh, and your glutes enough, and instead you're collapsing inwards, and it's also not great for the rest of your joints inside your body. So yes, in those situations, it makes sense if you invite your students to guide the knee towards the second and third toe. But again, remember, for the feet, for your students, there's so much variation for the feet. Sometimes for your students, your feet will look like this, they point straight ahead. Sometimes they turn out slightly. Sometimes they are inwards like this. So also for the toes, it doesn't make sense as well. Are the second and third toes always facing forward? This is the same for your hands as well. Now I would like to invite you to think about it. When you come in Warrior 2, you can look down at your own feet. And normal stance, so-called normal stance, average stance, when you're standing, do your second and third toe point straight ahead? Or are they actually slightly off the side, inside, outside? You know, which toe is actually in the middle or pointing straight ahead? And consider all of these and consider how your cues, actually match to this. So you should, and all these will affect when you cue for your students what they are looking out for. So this is very, very important. Another way of cueing to encourage your students to not let the knees collapse inwards is to actively invite them to actively press on the outside of the big toe mound. So you're not outside of the big toe, the little toe mound. So remember the 4 points that we talked about. I'm going to show you my feet again. So this part and this part, these two are very, very important. When your knee collapses inwards, if you want to balance it out, what happens? You do the opposing. So you press on the outside here. So when you press on the outside, naturally it will allow the knee to move into a more optimal alignment. When you collapse inwards, when the knee collapses inwards, most of the weight is on the big toe mound and the inside corner of the heel. So the way to do it the other way, from the other side, is to press down. So this is why also we cue from down up. Instead of an aesthetic thing, which is using at the knee and you tell people to let the knee move this way, press down from underneath your feet so that you can feel this from bottom up. This is another way of doing this that you might want to consider. Okay, so now I think finally we have completed, or we have managed to talk about most of the lower body cues. Of course, I can go on forever about this, but these I would think are the most important ones that you might want to consider. Now let's move up towards the rest of the body. Okay, so we are moving from the feet towards, just now we talked a little bit about the ankles, the knees. Now let's talk a little bit about the glutes. Very popular, right? The glutes and the spine. Okay, if we think about the glutes, one big thing that I would really like to encourage you guys to think about is sometimes in poses like bridge pose, even in wheel pose, you might hear teachers say relax your glutes or soften your buttocks. And then I would ask again, what is the purpose? The reason why teachers invite you to do that is so that you use the effort from the rest of your body more, and maybe you feel this lift from more of your pelvis and you're working more with your spine, with your quads that wrap around the top of your legs rather than your glutes, which are contracting to push up. But, however, very, very important but, if the individuals you work with have lower back pain, right? The glutes are one of the most important muscles that they should be strengthening, that they should be working with. I will understand because I have had piriformis syndrome and I have some problem with my lower back on one side before, and it was so painful. Even now, from time to time, when I'm not mindful, sometimes the pain comes back. And one of the most important things that the physio has told me to do, and that I realized from my own experience, is to engage the glutes. The glutes are so important, and they wrap around your buttock and are attached to and close to your lower back for a reason, because they support the front, your abdominals, your pelvis area. So you should not actually relax your glutes. There's no problem, and you don't want to squeeze the butt too much in these back bends or in these poses, because you want to make sure that there's right amount of effort. But relaxing the glutes means you're not giving your lower back enough support. So definitely, personally, I'm against the cue of saying relax your buttocks or soften your glutes, so on and so forth. Very, very important. I would invite you to reconsider this cue. If you're not convinced, try it yourself. Right? When you're doing bridge pose, try it without engaging your glutes at all. Switch off your glutes and then try it with an adequate amount. You squeeze the glutes or engage the glutes just a little bit for the lift, and then for the rest of it, use the support of your back, lengthen your quads away from you, and then also, very important, actively press down through your feet. That's the fundamentals. That's the most important in bridge pose. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about your glutes. Now I want to talk a little bit about the curvature of your spine, and very important, your tailbone. Sometimes you will hear instructors say tuck your tailbone, even in chair pose, for example. That's quite popular. And again, I think the question would be why? What is the purpose of inviting your students to tuck the tailbone under, to scoop the spine in? One exercise that my teacher often did with us is he would get us to do cat-cow in chair pose. Inhale to arch the spine, really exaggerate the arch. Exhale to round the spine, really scoop that tailbone in the opposite direction. A few more times like this, and then gradually find the middle. So I'm not a huge fan of scooping the tailbone in myself, because I feel that that is not a reflection of a natural spine. Because having studied anatomy, actually, the human body has no straight bones. There's not a single completely straight bone in your body, and your spine is full of curves. So the best thing we can do is actually honor the curves in your body. So it's an idea of finding what is neutral and that honors the natural curvature of your spine. And again, this might differ. So some people's, like for example, my husband is not here, but he has a vertebrae, two vertebrae that have been melted together, and it was because his doctor mentioned it might be when he was growing, he grew so fast, and he's a very, very tall man. He grew so fast that maybe the amount of calcium, the milk he was drinking, was not enough, and so as a result, the two vertebrae have fused together, and so his curves of his spine look very different from mine. He has an extremely arched back, and his neck also is very, very arched. So that would surface very differently, right, as compared to someone who has a more so-called average or regular spine. And then again, if you're working with someone who has scoliosis, who has a C-shaped or S-shaped curve, how would that look? Think about all of these things and the actual real bodies that you're working with, instead of the skeletal average that we often see in textbooks. So this is why I invite you to think about when you do many of the poses, right? Instead of inviting the students to tuck the tailbone in out of fear that would cause lower back pain if they arch their spine too much, invite them to find what is in between. So to navigate and feel for themselves, because you can only do so much seeing from the outside. Your students need to understand what it feels like from the inside, so they can guide themselves. And I think this is truly what we can do as instructors, as teachers or coaches, depending on what word you would like to use for yourself, to really help your students. Okay, so now we reach the spine. And today's episode is a little bit longer, so we still have 2 more cues, and I will quickly go through them. This one, the next one, is quite important. Often you will hear teachers say, or maybe you might even say this yourself, square your hips. Okay, in, for example, warrior 1, in, for example, pyramid pose, in, for example, what else? High lunge position, for example, you might hear this also. And also in twists as well, you might hear teachers say, square the hips. Okay, and I think again, if we go back to the intention, it is because we don't want, most teachers are concerned that the students might have their body turned out too much, too far off from the side. And that, for example, when you fall forward, instead of complete flexion, it might be flexion with a twist. So it is well-meaning, the idea of squaring the hips. However, as I've mentioned in the last masterclass, anatomically, it is not possible to square your hips. If we look at warrior 1, your front foot is completely facing forward. Your front knee is bent. So it is a neutral stance. But your back foot is turned out, externally rotated at a 45 degree, 60 degree. It really depends again on your anatomy, a certain angle. So it's externally rotated a little bit. So how can the pelvis, it cannot completely face forward. So how can you invite your students to square the hips if from bottom up it doesn't reflect a square or neutral orientation? The only time where your hips should ever be completely neutral or square is in mountain pose. Is in the poses where, for example, even wide-legged forward fold. Finally, in wide-legged forward fold, you only abduct the legs. So you widen the legs like this, but your pelvis is completely facing forward. Your entire body is facing forward. So yeah, your hips can be squared. But in asymmetrical poses, it is not possible to completely square your hips. That's just doesn't make sense. And so when we invite our students to square their hips, what are you trying to do? So ask yourself this and invite your students or invite yourself to see if there's any other way of honoring the principle of trying to come to a more neutral alignment while being safe, while not inviting your students to do something that is not impossible. Okay, and with twists as well, what happens is in the recent years in the yoga world, there have been a rise in the number of cases of injuries relating to the sacroiliac joint. So the SI joint is a very important joint that fuses your hip with the last part of your tailbone with your sacrum. So that part is very, very important. What happens in asymmetrical poses is there's this torsion of your pelvis. Imagine your pelvis is like this. So it's like a butterfly shape. So when you do an asymmetrical pose, actually there's this action, and one side of your pelvis is kind of a little bit more forward, the other side might be a little bit back, which is fine. But when, for example, you do a twist, right? So if you, let's say we do a chair twist even, and your pelvis is rather straight, when you twist towards the right, I know that it is well-meaning, you want your students to twist from the torso, and you want to keep the hips as level as possible. Very naturally, to keep your body safe, the whole of your spine will follow. So your joint, your hip, right, and your sacroiliac joint with your tailbone is connected with your spine, is connected with your chest. When you move your chest, it is very normal that your hip will follow. And if you want to encourage your students to rotate more from the chest, you can invite them to do so. Inhale, lengthen the spine. As you exhale, feel your chest area or your thoracic spine revolve. So focus on that rather than inviting your students to square their hips forward. So that will actually reduce the risk of your students suffering from any injuries relating to the SI joint. And if you have any questions with regards to SI joint injuries, you can look further into the work of Donna Fahy. She's one of my teachers. She's really great. She's done a fair amount of research and work into this, and she is the leading expert on this SI joint related kind of injuries and with regards to the pelvis as well. So the last point I wanted to talk about, and again, there are so many cues, but The last thing I want to talk about is the idea relating to your shoulders. Okay, so very often you might hear when you're invited to raise your arms all the way towards the sky, is that you might hear teachers say, pull your shoulders down or keep your shoulders down. Okay, I just want to say anatomically, again, it is not possible. So when you raise your arms up towards the sky, your shoulder blades, they will move up. They are like, imagine they are like two wings, and they actually circle and wrap upwards. There's this upwards moving action like this. So when they move up, naturally this part of your shoulders will come up a little bit. So it's impossible to raise your arms up towards the sky without having your shoulders come up. The intention, however, behind this cue is often because in classes you might see students doing this, right? When they are doing arms above the head by the sides of the ears. Why? Because they cannot relax this part, which is the trapezius muscle, which wraps around the top of the shoulders, and instead they raise everything together along with their arms. So a nice cue that you might want to consider, or that you might want to do, as you say, inhale, float your arms up towards the sky, and then you might want to say, inhale, raise your shoulders towards your ears. As you exhale, soften and relax. Feel the spaciousness between your shoulders and your ears. So I often do that as well, just to get students who are doing this to become more aware that they can keep their arms up like this, and their shoulder blades are wrapping up actually as they do this, because that has to happen when you do this. And even with this, they can isolate this movement, and this is called elevation and depression. Elevation and depression, right? And we can do this even with your arms up as well, and you can keep this down. So this is the intention, or I believe the rationale behind the idea of pulling your shoulders down or softening the shoulders down. So again, if you cue your students through a certain movement, you should be explaining to your students, you should be guiding them to understand why they are doing this. What is the purpose of doing this? So what's wrong with this? There's nothing wrong with this. You're contracting your trapezius muscle, right? It's actually okay. It's just, if we do this for a long time, it's very strenuous and it's not comfortable for the neck. It may cause unnecessary strain in the neck. So you can invite your students to relax, and they can still find rightful engagement without necessarily causing this strain in the trapezius muscle. So yeah, I think I've come to the end of today's 7 cues. As a quick recap, and the first one was with regards to your feet, right? Considering whether the feet should be together, whether they should be slightly apart. Also, I didn't even talk about whether the feet should be turned out, turned in, whether they should be parallel as well. The other cues relating to the lower part of your body are, for example, the alignment of your heels in the wider stances, whether it's warrior 2, triangle, whether it's heel to heel to back arch, so on and so forth. And then also we looked at, for example, pressing down on the inside corner of your big toe, or instead it should be pressing down on all 4 corners of your feet, and then depending on, notice whether you collapse outwards or inwards, and then press on the opposite direction to balance out, to find that stability. The other thing we looked at was also whether your knee should track or move in the direction of your second and third toe. And again, there's so much skeletal variation from human to human, right? So we should see and we should observe, does that make sense for you? Does that make sense for your students? Okay, and then moving further up, yeah, we also looked at the knee, whether it should be bent at only a 90-degree angle, or is it actually okay to bend it more than 90 degrees, and in which poses, right? For which purpose? Then we looked at the higher part of your body. We looked at the glutes, and I would highly encourage you to encourage your students to recruit the glutes. And now it's not soft, and I'm all for always recruit the glutes, right? Recruit the glutes. Glutes recruitment day, very, very important. We looked at the tailbone as well, whether or not you should tuck the tailbone, or whether you should look to honoring that natural curve, that neutral curve in your spine. So not someone else's spine, but your spine. And also we looked at the hips, how it is impossible to actually square your hips, especially in asymmetrical poses. And then even in chair pose, as you do a twist, how you can square the hips and how that might be affecting your SI joints. And then lastly, we looked at your shoulders, which is, with regards to how you can still keep this area relaxed, your traps relaxed, while raising your arms towards the sky, this working with the back of your shoulder blades. So with this, we come to the end of today's masterclass. Next week's one will be a little bit more about the structure of how you can begin to cue in a very systematic way that makes sense and that doesn't overwhelm, of course, especially if you're a new yoga instructor. You might feel very stressed out thinking about how many cues you would have to say for a specific pose, and you only have a limited amount of time. Do you say 3 cues? Do you say 5 cues per pose? How do you begin to do that? So I will talk more about this next week. I'm just having a quick look about this, the comments. Good, thank you. Great, Cecile, I'm very happy that you're tuning in. Idma as well, very glad that these the tips from today resonated with you and that they make sense for you. So in the meanwhile, if any of you have any questions, you're very welcome to drop a comment in today's masterclass. You can always drop me a private message as well on Facebook if you have any questions as you're planning your class sequences. And then in the meanwhile, please take care. I hope you have a great week ahead, and I'll see you next week the same time on a blueprint or framework for your cueing. So stay tuned and see you then. Bye.